Tonight is all about courage, displacement, and home. We're going to be exploring those themes. And looking ahead at the coming years and decades, mass displacement is likely to exponentially increase. In a recent report from the Institute of Economics and Peace, I read an absolutely staggering statistic. There's an estimated up to 1.2 billion people may be displaced as a consequence of climate change or natural disasters by 2050. And I think for all of us, looking ahead into this future that will be disrupted by a heating biosphere, there's a real need for all of us to reimagine what it means: home, belonging, and hospitality. And as we reimagine what those things mean, we have so much to learn from people who bring stories of courage alongside histories of displacement. And I'm so thrilled and delighted that we have Aarif and Rihab and Kolbassia here this evening to bring this conversation alive for us. Tonight's event is part of a bigger piece of work, an event series at St. Ethelburga's on the theme of faith and moral courage. And in this program, we're asking very big and profound questions about where courage comes from, how we can grow our own inner capacity to brave our limits, and what does it mean to engage in that as a collective process together. We're hugely grateful to our partners at the Fetzer Institute for their generous support of this work. And I'd like to invite Sylvester Jones from the Fetzer Institute to come up now and share a few words with us.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me begin by saying thank you for showing up for this wonderful program. I thought long and hard about preparing remarks, but I decided that I would let the Spirit lead me in this moment. This is my first time in London, my first time outside of the United States, and I come here with joy in my heart to show our support and appreciation for the work that the Fetzer Institute is doing with our partners at St. Ethelburga's Center for Peace and Reconciliation. Please give them a hand, Claire, Martin, and Terrell. Please give them a hand. As you have heard Claire mention, this is a partnership between the Fetzer Institute and St. Ethelburga's. The mission of the Fetzer Institute, and I hope it moves you as much as it moves me, helping to build the spiritual foundation for a loving world. Again, let me repeat that for someone who may have not heard something that I mentioned, helping to build the spiritual foundation for a loving world. Perhaps you may not have heard me, so I'll do it a third time. Helping to build the spiritual foundation for a loving world. I've come to understand that working to being a loving relationship with your neighbor, someone you know and someone you may not know, takes courage. I've come to understand that working to have a relationship that's grounded in love that allows you to do something that you may not feel comfortable doing takes courage. And I've come to understand that doing something that may not be routine for you, for someone that doesn't look like you, takes courage. So I decided to embark on faith and courage and come to London for today. I wanted to be present for this moment to see how many people believe that the work that St. Ethelburga's and the Fetzer Institute is doing is important enough to show up on a Sunday. Now, I don't know about you, but I enjoy playing and watching basketball. As I understand, here in London, you enjoy playing and watching football. So perhaps there was an opportunity to play or watch football today, but you decided to show up here, right? So I want to thank you all for taking the time to come out and have whatever the experience you might have around faith and moral courage. We're excited about this important work that we're doing with St. Ethelburgers, and I just wanted to be here to see in person the person that I often cry with on the Zoom calls. Claire and I have developed a wonderful relationship, and I believe that it's not only grounded in faith and courage and love, but I believe that it's grounded in authenticity. When I show up on the Zoom screen, I show up as this man that has never been to London, and I believe that she shows up as this young lady who loves this work dearly. So our relationship is grounded in faith, it's grounded in love, it's grounded in courage, and it's grounded in authenticity. As we go forth, not only today, but after today, hopefully you'll develop and support relationships that are grounded in those things as well. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Claire, for being a wonderful partner. And let's go forth and have a wonderful conversation about courage. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Sylvester. Thank you. So now I'm just going to hand over to Joe Winslow, who's the project manager for our Refugee Allies program, and who's going to be hosting the panel discussion this evening.
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you, Sylvester, and thank you so much, everybody, for coming today. And at the beginning, Claire was asking who'd been here before, and there were many people, or who hadn't been here before, and there were many people who have. So maybe in those moments where we break for dinner, where we chat with each other, you can look out. Those who know St. Ethelburgers well, look out for those who maybe don't know St. Ethelburgers well, maybe even here on their own. So at the heart of the project, which People of the Earth is the project, it used to be called Refugee Allies, and it's now People of the Earth. And at the heart of that is hospitality and friendship and encounters. And that's really what it's about. And the themes of home and displacement have been ones that have really occupied that project's work. And we have learnt from our friends, from our guests, from our participants, that displacement has many different meanings, as does home. That displacement isn't the terrifying and traumatic removal or forced displacement from a physical home, but it can also be a sense of dislocation and a sense of losing one's sense of belonging. And home, too, we've learned, has many different meanings. It can be the place that we physically grew up with, that we carry in our bones and DNA. And it can also be a place in our heart, it can be in our faith, and it can be where we choose it to be. And the reason I say these things is because very often we think of people who are displaced, or words like home, as potentially referring to other people, to people who aren't us. But as Claire was saying, we are coming into a time when we will all be moving for one reason or another. And these themes of displacement and home impact all of us. One of the things that we've not really explored before is courage, and I really hope that today that we can all explore that journey together. And on your seats you will have found all sorts of things, programs and flyers and also coloured card, and we'll come back to that later, and hopefully a pen. This evening we have 3 really special guests. They are people who work on the front line as well as internationally. They are people with whom we have a story so far. We have co-created events together, there have been performances, and we have enormous respect for the work that they do, and it's a great honour to consider them friends of St. Ethelburgers. I'm going to say a little bit about each of our speakers today. Please bear with me, the printer broke. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about them, and then I'm going to invite them to take their seats. Because sometimes it really is a little strange to be speaking about. I think it's much better. And we can welcome you in. So I shall start with Rihab. And you would have heard Rihab's music as we came in. So Rihab was born in the Syrian city of Homs to a musical family. Her father, Lucia Samir Azar, made her first oud and started teaching her when she was only 7 years old. She pursued her musical aspirations at the prestigious Conservatoire of Damascus, and in 2014 she became the first woman oudist to perform, accompanied by the Syrian National Orchestra for Arab Music. In 2015, Rihab was awarded sponsorship by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to pursue a master's degree in music education. And it is an incredible award to have been given. And it was reflected when the following year the Arts Council England recognised Rihab as a musician of exceptional promise. She has toured and performed internationally, and you will have heard her music as you came in this evening. Our second guest is Kolbassia Haoussou, and Kolbassia is Department Head of Survivor Empowerment Directorate at Freedom from Torture. He began his career in campaigning and advocacy when he co-founded the Survivors Speak Out network, a network led by those who had survived torture and campaigned on and with and on behalf of survivors. In 2020, he received an MBE for his service to torture and sexual violence survivors in the Queen's New Year Honours List. And alongside his campaigning work, Kolbassia runs a music studio. I'm very glad to hear about this. I run a music program here, so I'm very excited to hear about this, Kolbassia. A music studio, and he mentors young people at risk of exclusion. And last, but certainly not least, Aarif Ibrahim. Aarif is a barrister, author, and public speaker practicing law at Garden Court, North Chambers in Manchester. He specialises in international criminal and international human rights law and public international law. Over the last few years, he has advised extensively and assisted on setting up tribunals and inquiries, the most recent of which were the Special Tribunal for Crimes of Aggression against Ukraine and the Uyghur Tribunal, a people's tribunal to investigate China's alleged genocide and crimes against humanity against Uyghur, Kazakh, and other Turkic Muslim populations. He's co-founder of the Yazidi Justice Committee and has published a report that is the first to consider issues of state responsibility in relation to the Yazidi genocide. Aarif is author of A Constitution of the People and How to Achieve It. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for a very warm welcome for our speakers. Please take your seats. So, for any of those particularly aware of these things, we didn't set up that Rihab and I would be sitting at one end and Kolbassia and Aarif would be setting up at the other. It's simply how the microphones work. So, I'm just going to take us through some questions. And it is such a pleasure to have all three of you here. And thank you for being here and agreeing to enter into this conversation. So the first question that I would like to ask all of you is, you strive for excellence in all your work, and I wonder about the challenges you may face and overcome, because you clearly overcome them to keep pursuing the work that you do. And so my first question to you is a very simple one, is what does courage look like to you? And I wondered if I could go first to you, Kolbassia.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe, and thank you, St. Ethenberger, to really put that event together and also inviting us here today. And I think that's my second time, being here, and I'm really grateful for that. So without wasting much of my time, I think I want to just, highlight, this way how, courage look like for me. And I think, courage is defined by our actions, right? Every action that we take does represent, our courage. And what motivates us to take those actions? And there's only two things that motivates us, take those actions. Sorry, I don't remember your name, but I want to quote you. Sylvester. I think Sylvester and also Claire mentioned things that when I was sitting there listening to you both, kind of capture my imagination, and I start framing my question according to what you say. I think both of you use the word love, right? And I'm going to add one more element, is fear. Fear and love, they are from the same element. The feeling that we have only two types of feeling. One is fear and one is love. Every action that we take are motivated by those two elements, whether either is by fear or is by love. I'm going to mention two characters. Then you cannot mix them in the same box. They're opposite, side of the thing. One is Hitler, and the other one is Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. Martin Luther King's action is motivated by love. Hitler motivated by fear, and we know what he have done later. After that, I don't want to get into that. So we all, every single morning when we wake up, we have those fears within ourselves, and we battle with it. Which one we take? Either we allow love to take over and motivate our action and motivate us moving forward, or we allow fear motivating us. And everything that you see now in the society are only motivated by those two. And without that, everybody sitting here today in this room, your action is motivated by love. Otherwise, we're not going to be sitting here discussing an element which is important, like this displacement, like listening to us that have to go through torturous journey to get somewhere where we want to feel safe, we want to feel home, and so and so. So for me, courage is the action that you put every single day toward the community, toward the society, toward the other person, and also, toward yourself, as such. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Kolbassia. We won't take questions now, but we will take questions. There will be a time for a Q&A later, so please store up the questions that you have. And Rihab, I wondered if I could ask you the same question.
Sure.
What courage means to you?
Yeah, well, I think courage in different phases of your life and different situations can mean so many different things. So it's a really massive question. And I'm mindful that maybe I will be answering it from where I am at now in my life. But for example, this morning I was reflecting about how can I pinpoint some of the things that relate to courage in my mind. And what came to my mind are a few things related to our being in the world as individuals, but also as social beings, and what that navigation requires of us. And in a lot of times, it requires a massive amount of courage to be an individual, but also a social being. So I thought about the individuality plus the collective. I thought about static kind of realities as opposed to dynamic. And I think courage plays a huge role in breaking free from what we consider as a static structure, whether it's an institution or whatever that resembles to each one of us. That dynamic against the static. It takes courage to move from one to the other, whether you're trying to establish some kind of system or trying to break free from something. I also thought about risk, because courage is always related to risk. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been called anything. It would have been, yeah. So there is risk, and with risk comes vulnerability, and comes responsibility. Because usually, when you're being brave about something, you don't really know how it's gonna go necessarily. So yeah, it's a very vulnerable place to be. And also, it's a commitment that I'm going to see it through. So that's the responsibility element. Yeah, and what else? Yeah, for me, other things I thought about was to do with our being in the world, being aware and willing to accept that our being in the world is a political thing, whether we want it or not. And it's a brave thing to decide to see that and accept it and move with it, push it, and yeah, follow what that means. And the last one I'd like to mention now is to do with things that are related to the past and the present and the future. Courage is making sense of what you know, making sense of what's happening now, what you're doing, what you want to do, and also seeing what could be, what's not here, what's not in the past, not in the present, not necessarily yet planned for the future, but that imagination as well. That's for now. Thank you.
So Aarif, we come to you for the same question.
Thank you very much, Jo. Can I begin firstly by thanking St. Ethelburgers for the invitation. All of you spending your Sunday evening with us. I know a lot of work goes into putting an event together like this, so special thanks to Claire, Carol, the team, and last but not least Jo, who curated all of this to bring this together. In terms of my answer for what courage means, I guess I've got three aspects to this. One is the kind of abstract aspect to it, which I think we can all probably look up in the dictionary, but there's obviously got different aspects to what we mean by courage. The second aspect is my personal relationship with it, and in particular my relationship with my work. And then finally, I guess, is this idea of fear, which both Kolbassia and Rihab have touched upon, fear and risk. In the abstract sense, I tend to think about courage as a state of mind or orientation or disposition towards the difficult or towards challenging or towards even the insurmountable. In extremis, we are thinking about a state of mind towards something that's unstoppable, inescapable, extremely difficult. How do I then inculcate that personally? There are really two aspects to this. So a lot of my work focuses on assisting the marginalized, the dispossessed, the disenfranchised. So these are survivors and victims. And of course, what that does is it puts me into proximity with harm, proximity with injustice, proximity with individuals who've suffered immense horrors often, which we ourselves find it difficult to really appreciate. So in a way, when I talk about courage, I'm talking automatically, given the context and time, from a privileged position. I'm not in a conflict zone. I'm not immediately being affected by catastrophic climate change. And therefore, yes, I have difficulties. I have an option where I've picked a profession where that entails some sort of sacrifice to time, maybe some sort of sacrifice to family life or relationships because of the time that's involved. Even on again, in extremis, some form of vicarious trauma or mental health troubles, because you've obviously got to confront and assist individuals who suffer immensely. So in that sense, there's an element of courage to it. But of course, that completely pales into insignificance when you are actually talking about victims and survivors, because if you are talking about victims and survivors of crimes against humanity or genocide, war crimes, crimes of aggression, which Joe has referred to earlier, then of course you are talking about individuals who've been killed or tortured, who've suffered immense forms of discrimination and harm. And of course, for them, we might talk about courage. What does courage mean for them? And in the context of justice, it can mean many things, but often at the top of that list is accountability. And again, we think about context and specificity. Imagine being in an extremely authoritarian state. Imagine having no rule of law, no freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and on top of that having suffered what we call international crimes. Your agency and ability to achieve justice is very, very difficult. And so for them, courage entails all these things which Rihab has said, risks to them personally, to their family, and oftentimes that involves risk to their life and limb. So that's really, I guess, what I kind of relative. And then finally, I guess when we talk about courage, we can't escape fear. So both personally, both the people we are trying to help or assist, fear raises all sorts of things, doubts, questions, disempowerment, questions about agency. And of course, this is often forced upon us. And the question is, how do we respond to it, and what are we capable in terms of a response? And that brings me two things which I came across whilst preparing for this, if Joe would permit me to read them. One is a poem, and the second thing is an anecdote. I'll read the poem first. So this is a poem by Mark Hartley called Be Still. And it starts, while you think about what each note means, the band plays on. You are running from a dog who only chases you because you run. Turn and face him. Though you hear the buzzing of the bee grow louder, be still. Do not fear a sting you have never felt. You just might be a flower. Do not worry about things falling into place. where they fall is the place. Now, this is of course a really beautiful poem, really talking about the power of an inward orientation. How do we present ourselves in the face of the unknowable, the unquantifiable, the hopefully improbable, and sometimes a danger which we may not have faced previously. But of course, an inward orientation is always conditional. You sometimes may have an inward orientation to something extremely difficult, completely outside your control. And no matter your inward orientation, the external forcing upon you, and in this I'm thinking in my mind about victims and survivors who have to suffer harm and injustice on the part of another, an inward orientation may not be enough.
Thank you so much to all three of you for bringing the heart and thought that comes with your responses. And I have specific questions that I'd like to ask you. There's a lovely, I think it was 2016, Rihab was interviewed by the BBC. And in part of that interview, there was something you said which has really stuck with me, which was, and forgive me if I paraphrase slightly, I know you will correct me. All I came here with was my culture and my music is how I share my love for people. And I really love that because it really shines through in your music, Rihab.
Thank you, Joe.
And so you left Syria, and for now you've made London your home. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about your relationship between living here in the UK and your music, which is rooted in such a rich and ancient traditions of Syria.
Thank you very much for the question. Music for me was a very massive integration vehicle for me to actually feel that I can have a good life here. Education was great. The course I traveled to start doing was brilliant, and it was amazing, but it was only for 1 year. But beyond that, not that many people knew me, not many people knew what I do, what I have done. I was like zero in here. Like, that's an exaggeration, but music was the thing that I had ready to share. And within that, I hope people could see that I play it with passion, I play it with desire to come together over moments of listening and sharing music. So to be honest, I don't know how my life would have been having moved countries if it wasn't for music. I don't know how I would have felt gradually at home. Yeah, through music I've been able to meet so many interesting people from very different cultures, and I learned also through those encounters how rich this country can be because of the multiplicity and the different influences. And I can definitely say that at that time I felt I can be home, because home is everyone, and it is so many different kind of people. And yeah, for me that feels like home when I see that it has so many different languages, looks, cultures, food, ways of expression. Does that answer your question?
It's beautiful, and I just wanted to ask you, is whether you have, whether there are particular pieces of music or particular notes or chords which you return to when you either want to inspire yourself or motivate yourself or soothe yourself even?
A lot of that will have to do with what I'm going through and also the nature of the instrument, because Daoud, as you could all hear, is kind of spooky in itself. Like whatever you play, it feels like, right, we're there, we're in the zone. No note is like just casually played, it's all so dense and yeah, but I think when I want to go maybe more inwards and towards my previous self, I would choose like Bayati, for example. Bayati is a very kind of folky maqam in Arabic music. So I remember the Bayati pieces I love and I've played since a very long time. And sometimes I write new music on like C minor or something. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. Thank you, Rihab. And for Aarif, could I ask you, you work with people who are, and I had to choose my words carefully here, you work with people who are extremely unsafe in their own homeland and sometimes beyond it. Among them, Yazidis, Uyghurs, Hazars, Kazakhs, and Ukrainians. As a human rights lawyer, what do you need to consider when you try and obtain justice for people, and how does this relate to courage?
So I think I often like to frame the question in a way when I'm asked about often survivors and victims, because there's a misnomer that we all probably have that law is the same as justice, and law is not the same as justice. Law is at best, in an ideal world, is an approximation. At best, it's an approximation, because laws, of course, are crafted by us. Anybody who's worked in a parliamentary space or in politics knows that they are often created last minute. All sorts of bargaining happens when laws are created. They fall very far short of what you might call moral obligations. And so in that context, I guess courage is contextualized and it's time specific, space specific. So if we talk, let's say, two examples, one is Russia, the second is China. I'm not going to talk about politics, I'm purely talking from a legal perspective. These states, like our state here in the UK, have signed up to all sorts of international conventions and treaties which are designed to protect human lives. So there is the Genocide Convention, there is conventions to prevent torture, there are conventions to stop unlawful discrimination, and yet, despite this, 21st century, we see regularly the commission of international crimes on a widespread scale. So when we talk about war crimes or crimes against humanity or genocide or aggression, in the Chinese context, we have ongoing international crimes which have been designated by the UN of the Uyghur minority in the west of China as crimes against humanity and possibly genocide. And we have ongoing crimes in Ukraine of principally the crime of aggression, from which have flowed all sorts of other international crimes, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Now, of course, that context is very different from being safe relatively here in the UK, but we also have violations of rights here in the UK on the part of the state. So, right to protest, the right to freedom of assembly, the right to asylum. So in light of that, I often like to think about courage as stages. So you have perhaps three stages we might categorize them. The first is seeing injustice and acting. The second is seeing injustice and, if you can't act, at least speaking out. And the third might be that if you see injustice, then you can't even speak out against it, then thinking at least about it. And of course, when we think back now to the context, it might be absolutely impossible for a victim or survivor already marginalized, already disenfranchised, already in extremely difficult circumstances to act. It might be impossible for them to speak, but at the very least they may be able to think about it. And this brings us, I guess, to a question which we all might relate to, is what obligations and responsibility, knowing these stages of courage, does that entail on us, whether we're lawyers or musicians or NGO activists? What questions does this really lead to today? So take, for example, Russia or China. We, for instance, have done business with Russia and China for a very long time. Now, you might say, we obviously saw in February of last year what's been designated as a crime of aggression against Ukraine. Now, anybody who is familiar with the situation in Ukraine will tell you that actually Russia had already annexed Crimea in 2014. 2014 and 2015, it had annexed de facto parts of the Donbass. Already there was a history of interference politically in a sovereign state. Both in Ukraine and in parts of the Eastern Europe and in Russia, there was already widespread violation of human rights. And of course, we had a possibility as economic actors, as lawyers, as business people, of intervening a long, long time ago. And mass atrocity crimes have long gestation periods. They don't happen suddenly or, on one day. They happen because of systematic inequality and discrimination going back a very long time. And so that immediately raises the question of when should we have started speaking up about it? When should we have questioned whether we could carry on business as usual? When should we have done the steps that we were able to take legally and politically? And so that was just to take one example, but I think often we have to ask ourselves, when is it too late? Is it already too late now? And when is it our responsibility to engage in these steps of courage? Perhaps I might leave it there. I have got a bit more to add, but I guess the point I often raise is that not only are we asking for justice from states and powerful actors, in the sense that they may well be legally obliged to do that. And China, Russia, the UK, they all have legal obligations upon them. But who are these legal obligations to? Yes, to human beings and survivors, but ultimately they are also to us as citizens of generally democracy. And of course the states will not do anything unless the citizens oblige them to do so. And often we only see that when we've got to a stage where it's often too late, where we talk about revolution or we talk about catastrophic climate change, which has already happened. And the question is, when do we start acting courageously in order to prevent these harms in the first place?
And just to say that I think why I think that this is important is that there are at the moment, according to the UN, over 89 million people who are displaced as a result of war, persecution, human rights abuses, a number which is going to increase exponentially and does not include those who are going to be displaced due to our warming world. And how the different ways that we create spaces for people understand understand the communities that we create and the redress that people have, I think are big questions for the future, or for now. And Kolbassia. So alongside your campaigning work, you are a role model for many of those you have worked with in Survivors Speak Out, the network, and among your colleagues and friends. And should anybody, can I reference your film,
Yeah.
Kolbassia? Kolbassia has made an incredibly powerful and very moving autobiographical film. It's only about 3 minutes long. But if you Google Kolbassia Haoussou, and from immigration detention to honors, is it the Queen's honor?
Yeah.
The Queen honor list, you will get to see this stunning, I have to say it's very beautiful.
Thank you.
I found it a very beautiful film, even, and a very brutally honest. And I wanted to ask, what can we learn about courage from people who are rebuilding their lives in new and unfamiliar places and have sacrificed so much to be here?
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much. And I think when I just look there, I see Freedom from Torture there. And I think that's the organization where I work now. And that's the only organization that since I came here in the UK since 2005, that's the only organization that I work. And also, that's the organization that gave me rehabilitation. And during that period of rehabilitation, I was coming toward the end of my therapy. And when you're coming end of your therapy, it's no happy place to be in. You don't think that, I finished therapy or I'm graduating, I'm going. It is difficult time for you to transition from the therapy out to the world. Because within that therapy, you find comfort, you find courage. Because there's a people around you that love you and want to support you. You find a comfort zone. And you want to maintain that comfort zone, and you want to maintain that love. And when you feel that if you're out of that, you're going to be going outside there facing the world, and the world is danger. And at that moment, I was really thinking hard, what I want to do, what I'm going to be. I'm going to be as vulnerable again and facing the world, and I'm going to be targeted again. And also, who this person want to be. And I was thinking between, 3 elements, and all, questions that I've been asking myself. I wish I could have gone back, just the life before persecution, before torture, would be nice. I was free in my mind, wild, and one thing that I just want to help people. But realistically, I cannot get that person anymore. Because whatever happened with torture destroyed that person, destroyed the human that is in me. And one thing that you also need to understand about torture, the aim of torture is to silence you, to make you question yourself, question your freedom, question your voice, not allow you to be a human being. And rehabilitation is to undo that. So then I was there, figure out, I cannot go back, I cannot get that person anymore. So who I want to be? The opposite meaning of courage, what is that? Sorry? Fear. And I'll put another word. It's also started by C. The lack of courage is what for me, is coward. All right? If you don't display courage, and the other one. So then at that moment, I was thinking, if I respond to the aim of torture and not speaking up, not using my voice, how the future, how the history, society going to view me? As a courageous or coward? Right? So then I said, no, I don't want to be identified as a coward person. So then I need to do something. And the thing that I want to do, with all the anger that I had, anger not just back home that I flee, anger is also in the United Kingdom. The way that I came, I was really treated very badly. I was put in immigration detention sentence, and all those kind of treatment create anger on me. But one thing that I learned from my grandmother is that no matter how angry you are, it is not the individual person in front of you that is the cause of it. And if not, make sure not to put that anger on anybody else. Only put that the source that created the anger, not anybody else. So then what I have to do, I summon all the courage that I can get from seeing my grandmother one day dragging myself and my younger brother out of a ruin that bomb just fall on our house and dragging us to a refugee camp, because that for me is a courage. I want to be like her. So then I come up with the idea of using my voice. I want to use my voice. I want to show people that no matter how you persecuted me, no matter how you tortured me, you will never silence me. But my voice alone is not strong enough. And I start looking around and then try to find like-minded people, other torture survivors, that I want to show them that, yeah, we have a power. How can we use that power? And then a few of them are here. Nasrin is here, Delix is there, Alex is somewhere filming, and also Nadine sitting there. And together we created what is called SSO Speaker Network. And that's every single day, that's my motivation, that's my reminder. When I see Nadine or Nasrin, speaking out and fighting for injustice that other people suffered, and they're looking for justice, that's what motivates me. That's what gives me the fuel to feel that no matter what, the future will remember us, that we refuse to be coward and using our courage for the better of the society and the better of the world that we want to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kolbassia. So that brings us to the last question for our guest speakers before we come to you, the audience. And we're going to try a different sequence this time. We're going to start with you, Aarif. So this is a question that I'm going to ask all of you. And it relates really to the times in which we live. We live in dark and uncertain times where we're increasingly fearful of each other and of differences of all kinds. There's a word which I really like, which is unfamiliar. It's a word where how do we get to know those who are unfamiliar to us, unfamiliar in so many different ways. So my question, which might seem sort of counter to the theme here of displacement and home and courage, but I just thought that we might unpick a little bit the different qualities of courage. So the question is, beyond courage, what qualities do you think that we need to develop to create a more peaceful, hopeful home and world for future generations? So start with you, Aarif, please.
I think about this question in three specific ways, and I think there are three qualities I would identify. The first is attentiveness and awareness. The second is hope, and the final one is a familiar theme, but love in its widest conception. So attentiveness and awareness, I think probably everybody in this audience is relatively aware, otherwise you wouldn't be here on a Sunday evening. I think the point I'm trying to make is that awareness has an aspect of recognizing and acknowledging that we are all in some way interdependent and interconnected, and not just that we are interconnected, but justice and injustice, wherever it is interconnected and interdependent. There's a wonderful book by an author called Rebecca Solnit called Hope in the Dark, and she talks about an analogy drawn from mushrooms. So as many of you might know, mushrooms that we see and eat and often see in the forest are the sprouting body of fungi. And the fungi are all intimately connected through the mycelial network. And the mycelial network is intimately connected to the plant network, and plants use that network underground to communicate, to transfer resources, and of course the mycelial network uses the rotting plants as food in order to grow, which then result in the mushroom, the sprouting body. And it's a beautiful analogy because in much the same way, justice and injustice is connected in this manner. So if we see injustice or against, let's say, genocide of the Yazidis in Iraq or Syria, or the ongoing harm suffered by the Uyghurs, or the harm being suffered right now by Ukrainians, we all know that that's not far removed from us. The reason being is that the cotton, for instance, that we might be wearing might be made, might be processed by and picked by slave labor in Chinese cities, employing Uyghurs who have been forced to do that work against their will. We all know that the consequences of the conflict in Ukraine has led to price increases in our oil and gas, which means increase in our bills or increase in our interest rates indirectly. Similarly, we know that the harm suffered by Yazidis and others in, for instance, Syria and Iraq has led to massive inward flow of people, displacement, forcible transfer, deportation, which has obviously impacted all of us and impacts resources in Europe as much as the courts and justice systems and other aspects of our lives. So really we can't ignore justice far away because it has a direct and immediate relevance to all of us, and it brings us critically proximate to harm. We might not feel the harm ourselves, but we can understand it, we can appreciate, we can see the images. And I think that makes us attentive and aware, which means that in one way or another, we are compelled to courage. It might not be the courage of the survivor that Kolbassia has talked about, or Rihab has alluded to, but it's still a courage to be aware enough to help prevent some of these harms, where the harm has happened, to help perhaps in its redress, not just legal redress, but more than that. And ultimately, it might lead to reparations or reprieve of some sort to those victims and survivors. And that, I guess, goes back to this idea of degrees of courage and the necessity that it puts upon us. The second quality is this idea of hope. And I don't talk about hope in a passive sense, really much more in an active sense. There's a beautiful line by, or at least it was a lecture given by Cornel West in Harvard about a decade ago, where he was talking about familiar themes, and he was asked by somebody in the audience saying, so this is a professor who was very active in the civil rights struggle in America, and he was asked, do you have any hope? And his immediate response was, no, I have no hope whatsoever. And of course, a lot of the people in the audience were aghast that if this professor who was so successful in changing civil rights, implementing civil rights for African Americans has no hope, then what hope they do have, that do the rest of them have in the audience? And he said, I don't have hope, but I decide to be a hope. And I think that's a really important, even if subtle, distinction, that it's not just a hope in something sometime changing in some way, but actually taking the reins of hope by using what skills knowledge and networks that he has in order to do the most that he can do, even if it just means speaking out about injustice. And then the final aspect here is this idea of love. I'm reminded by another quote by Professor Cornel West, and he said that justice is what love looks like in public. And what does he mean by that? And I think when we have an idea of romantic sense of love, but love has various conceptions and almost concentric circles which are laid upon one another. And in politics, of course, it means this idea that we look across the table or the aisle to see the other. And love does not mean that you see the other and just accept everything. It means accepting critically their otherness, their difference, their distinction, the fact that they are unique. It doesn't mean, and I'm sure all of us are familiar with this, we agree on everything either. It means being able to accept someone fully, but still retain our individual identity and uniqueness. And I guess this idea that justice is what love looks like in public means that we've reached out to a sufficient extent in our society to address the wrongs, the harms, accept that that has been redressed despite the fact that the person doing it is wrong, but then reaching out to the extent that you've achieved an outcome that has benefited the person who has injured without necessarily destroying the person who has done the harm in the first place. And I think if we can get even halfway to achieving that sort of justice when we talk about the law, then we'll have advanced greatly as a civilization.
Thank you. Thank you. Kolbassia. So I'll just repeat the question again. Beyond courage, what qualities do you think we need to develop to create a more peaceful, hopeful home and world for future generations?
Thank you. I think that's not mean that I'm not preaching yet, and also that's not mean that because we are in the church, and I'm by religion I'm Muslim, but I read all the good. I read all the scripture, because for me, fundamentally, all the scripture is teaching us about love, about living with each other and loving each other, and also it's also say that we are created as the image of God, right? And for me, there is three things which are really important. I would just say, if you wanna figure out the image of God, what I said, the CSC, caring, sharing, and compassion. Right? Those three elements that when we, as an individual, in an individual level, and if we live with those three things, there is no threat that is greater, and fear will never enter your heart. We need to be caring for the stranger, and we need to be sharing, because there's enough for everybody, and also we need to be compassionate. I think we use the word compassion and compassionate quite so often, and sometimes we don't understand what we mean by that. Compassion is based on your understanding, let's put it this way, of vulnerability, of a moment of vulnerability where you find yourself in a position where you find really vulnerable, and either you're afraid of using your life, or afraid of not having something, or the moment where you feel that you are insignificant. Doesn't matter what is the experience is. Any experience of vulnerability teach us one single thing. At that moment of vulnerability, you will see life and your experience in a different light. Being compassionate is able kind of to dig a little bit on that experience that you have of vulnerability, so then you understand when another person in a position of vulnerability, you can put yourself in the shoes of that person. It's understanding that whatever happened to that person, it can also happen to me, right? And also, what I can do to wrap around, this person, action of love, action of sharing, and action of caring. And when we care about our neighbor, ultimately, the neighbor will care about ourselves too, because it's, both ways. When we share the little that we have, it's not that we're going to end up with nothing, but also the neighbor will share the little that they have with us. So if we have that really understanding of, I am no one without my community, I'm no one without the other person, whether that the person has a Syrian passport, whether that the person has Sudanese passport, or the person has Chinese passport, it does not matter. At the end of the day, we are human beings with aspiration, with a goal, and only desire to live a life in a peaceful and happy life. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have your turn. Yes. Beyond courage, what qualities do you think we need to develop to create a more peaceful, hopeful home, hopeful world for future generations?
I'll probably repeat a lot of what's been already said. It's been amazing. I was thinking that curiosity is a really important thing to in living collectively. Being curious about what responses, for example, you have in relation to something or someone. Self-awareness, I think both gentlemen touched on it. When we are self-aware, we get so many valuable pointers at the things we need to work on. Like, why do I react to you the way I react? If I look into that, it teaches me a lot about what I am equipped with already and what I need to be more open-minded about, for example. Self-awareness and curiosity about others is very important. Understanding that all of us are very complex beings, and the intersectionality of every single person you meet is a huge thing. And yeah, people are never, can never be simplified into like categories. This is that, this is that. Yeah, that big, really big eagle-eye view of everyone as individuals and where we fit into that and how we interact with them. Empathy is a big one because empathy, for example, I feel empathy is so much related with being aware of your privilege as well. Not taking anything for granted. If you're born or happen to be in a place where there aren't any dangers, for example, it's nothing to take for granted. You could be someone else, and you are someone else in like a different reality. It's all of us. Now, we are somewhere very scared, and yeah. So the empathy is a huge thing because it helps. It helps you to go and do something instead of. I read in the morning Aarif's blog on the Ethel website, and I loved a point you touched on, which was related to pragmatism in relation to change, and the fact that change needs time. So another quality that is really important for us to cultivate and for future generations to cultivate is to understand that there's not going to be instant gratifications when it comes to big things and heavy things. We need to educate and nourish that sense of historic being. We're all historic beings and we come do our bit. Hopefully we will have understood what happened before. That cohesion is very important. But also we need to understand that there are some things we need to do, although we're not going to live to see better times after them. So yeah, viewing ourselves as like a part of a historical, very long and possibly slow process is an important thing as well.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. I'm really struck by there's something that links all three of you, which was the kind of the bigger view. You were talking about mycelium. You were talking about, you know, when we do something for somebody, it kind of ripples out, and we need everybody. And you're the big view, the long view, and who is in our community, and who is creating our home, and how do we create home, and what are the steps of courage, what are these qualities of courage that is going to create a home. And as you so poignantly made, that, you know, it may not be within our generation that things will change. But to see ourselves as part of that story, how important is that? We did have something which I'm now going to invite you to do over lunch, over dinner, which is to find somebody, perhaps somebody you've never spoken to before, and just ask them, what is it from all of our three speakers that we've heard this evening, what is it that you're sitting with that's really landed with you? So I'd really like to invite you to do that during dinner. If you came with somebody, take that somebody and go and find some other people you haven't met, and just continue the conversation in that way. But now, what I would really like to do is invite questions from the floor. And the way that we're going to do this, but before we get to the questions, I wonder if we could put our hands together for a really warm appreciation for our three speakers. Thank you. Thank you. So is anybody sitting with questions that they would like to ask any of our speakers? And yeah, I can see some hands shooting up here. And can I remind anybody who's filming that if anybody is wearing a red ribbon, they prefer not to be filmed. So it may be something that, yes, just please edit out afterwards and please don't share on social media. Thank you. So the way that this is going to work is I'm going to ask you to say the question and then I'm going to repeat it so that we've got it on record. So, do you mind if I go to this gentleman first? Thank you. Yes, so your name and your question, please. So the question is we've talked a lot about peace. There's peace in the conversation today. And is the first step, surely the first step must be in talking about peace or seeking peace to confront and acknowledge the harm that's been done.
There's quite a lot to unpack in that question. And I think, if I can permit me to rephrase it a little bit, you're asking whether as a collective and as a society or as a state, they're all different things, whether we should admit our faults, and I think you're about to talk about Afghanistan and Iraq and other places, before we go about doing good elsewhere. I'll give you a practical example. So I have been assisting the Ukrainian government and others on trying to create what's called special tribunal for the alleged crime of aggression as being committed by Russia and Belarus and Ukraine. So in international law there is a crime, it's called crime of aggression, which essentially involves one state unlawfully invading another and then carrying out all sorts of other crimes. Now, all states in the world are bound by the prohibition on that. Basically, states can't go around invading one another and taking their territory. Now, the reason this tribunal is being created is because this is essentially what's happened in the Ukrainian context. And if this tribunal was successfully created, one day the senior military and political leaders of Russia and Belarus could find themselves in a courtroom, much like the Nazi war criminals were held to account after the Second World War. Now, some people have said and have criticized both the work I've done and the work a lot of Ukrainians and others are doing to say, you know, why should we create this tribunal? You know, why can't we create a tribunal for what the US and Britain did in Iraq? Why can't we create another tribunal to try this person and that person? What about other crimes that are happening in other countries right now? And of course, that's a legitimate question to the extent that it's these are wrongs and you accept and acknowledge these wrongs. You can accept and acknowledge these wrongs and say something should be done about them, but it still does not change the position in respect of the harm that is ongoing today, the harm that is being done right now, the right action that you ought to be doing right now is completely unaffected by the fact that somebody else did some other wrong in some other place. And so this idea, this whataboutery, would inhibit us from doing anything, any of the time, because each time you try to do something right, and the right thing to do right now is create this particular special tribunal, if we'd looked back at every other instance where something like that hadn't been done, we'll never move past that event. So they are not mutually exclusive. You can do the right thing now, which is merited by the situation, and do the right thing historically, or do the right thing going forward. And of course the question goes back to your original question, is who are you asking to do the right thing? Now, a state is composed of agents, organs, and officials. In the UK, for instance, we have a turnaround of the government every 4 or 5 years, usually. So it might be a completely different government today that was in power at the time the harm was done, firstly. And of course, those people, if they'd committed wrong, should be held accountable. And I'm almost finished here. And the only other thing is, of course, then the state and the government is different from, of course, the society. And are a people in a democratic society necessarily responsible for what some of their individual leaders may have done? So it's quite a complex question, which would probably take a whole day to go through and unpack, but I'm really grateful for you asking it.
Kolbassia, did you want to?
Yeah, I think, is it working, yeah? Microphone. Yeah, thank you, because that's a really very, very important question. I think, you know, for me, I just added to what you just say here, is that when we're thinking about, it's part of peace building. It's part of, you know, peace, and then, you know, learning from that, and then preventing for next time the same thing not happening. Is that part of prevention? But, you know, so far for a very long time, when we're thinking about that, one key stakeholder that is removed from that are the survivors, or are the citizen people suffering much of the time, you know, from those wars. And as long that those part of the overall move would never create, you know, the peace that we need to create, and we will never come to the position where we will learn from what happened and then not repeat it, again. So the solution it's not for the politician or the government that need to provide the solution, because they will never provide the solution for us, because what they will be looking at, looking in a political sense. But if we bring the citizen into it, we're thinking about how people suffered from those wars, and how those war and persecution, thank you, and how those war and persecution are really impacting the daily life of those people. Like, I think that's the most important part of the peace building. And if people are not happy, right, if people are not happy, if a group of people are not happy with the peace that is being put together, repetition going to happen. And we've seen that quite a lot throughout century, and throughout the world, where war finish, we think that we have a peace, and then after that, part of the group that fell marginalized come again and then create another one. Thank you.
And of course, with war comes from more displacement and more change in our communities, and the qualities that we have heard others express.
I personally think that is an essential first step, and it's not enough. It's there has to be making up for what's happened on the terms of the oppressed and those who are suffering because of it. It has to be. It can be a democratic process whereby, it has to be, the repair has to be on the terms of those who were wronged, and with a commitment to not ever do that again anywhere else. And it has to be like a proper commitment and repair. That's how I feel,
Thanks so much, Rihab. Other questions? Thank you so much. So the question being that some of the issues, some of the problems that we're facing in the world are intractable, and they have no end in sight. And at what point does one say, I've done enough?
It's a big one, because it's always that individual on the backdrop of society, and vice versa. But I think the easiest way to look at it without going insane is to not have a tunnel vision on something necessarily. I mean, if you're a politician, for example, you have to focus on something specific. But as people going about our business in daily life, the act of courage is everything we do, the values we live by, the interactions we have. And I mean, there has to be decisions to be made. Like, of course, if you, for example, someone asks you for help, you help to the degree that you can. But then if other areas suffer, now you can't do that. So I think there is pragmatism around how to balance living a good life with being courageous and also being a positive member of society. It's not an easy thing to navigate, but I think it's like the metaphor of the plane. You have to put the mask on, because if you're acting out from a kind of almost neurotic need to be doing something, that's not going to help anyone, even if you help. But the motivation has to be natural, non-reactive, and just constant, I think. Not necessarily something extreme and big and, Does that make sense? I expressed it so badly, I'm sorry.
I don't think you have at all, Rihab. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to add, I think early on also you said something that's really important, is that we may not see throughout our life the change that we want to create. And that's the same way where when I started doing advocacy and campaigning, that's the attitude that I have, that I am only carrying a baton, and I may not hand the baton to the next person. But as long that I do the much that I can do during my lifetime, I have done enough. Right? So it is not, and also is understanding, putting, your well-being at first as well, right? Because it's really important, because the work is really hard, because you work with material that is really, really difficult, to work with. And also, is that the result does not depend on us. The result never depends on us. But what depends on us is the voice and whatever the message that we want to share. Does depend on us. The rest is depend on another person, another individual, or another group. But one thing that we must not do is be silent. Because when we are silent, then we are part of the chaos that is being created. All right? If we are silent, we contributed to that chaos. There are some people that will not have the opportunity, the courage, and also the voice, to speak up. Those of us sitting in this room who have that privilege and have a voice and have a courage to speak for those people, let's do it. If you do it in your household, that's also good enough. If you do it with your neighbors, that's good enough. If we do it in front of group people like this one, it's good enough. The little that you can do, that you know that that's the maximum you can do, that's good enough. Thank you.
There's a really interesting diary of a Holocaust survivor called Ernest Bornstein called The Long Night, and that was recently translated by his daughter called Dr. Noemi Lopian, and she relates an encounter he found, he witnessed in a concentration camp at the height of the creation of the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. And that was when people were being killed in the concentration camp, when individuals were being tortured, when these emaciated individuals were in the courtyard of the concentration camp. Just a few meters away was an elderly German woman tending to her flowers in her garden, overlooking the concentration camp, and she could see right through, and they could see right through to her. So I relate that story because it makes you wonder that how is it, and that story is narrated, or variations of it, hundreds if not thousands of times in the accounts of Holocaust survivors. The question is, how do you get to that stage where a society perhaps accepts, acquiesces, turns a blind eye, permits, you create a permissive environment where horrors like that are possible. And of course this goes back to how mass atrocity crimes occur, that they have very long periods within which narratives have been created which allows those crimes to be committed, not by one person. A president can't just order that these crimes happen at the bottom. You require a society that's prepared for that. And the society is prepared for that by systematic inequality and discrimination, which dehumanizes people, that normalizes the dehumanization of particularly groups of people, where it becomes acceptable and permissible to treat them like that, where others won't see that the way they're being treated is necessarily bad or unjustified. And I say that because it then raises the questions of what narratives are being pushed today or created today where we might be complicit in it. And that then raises the possibility that almost every action that we do today, every interaction we have with others, every little microaggression, every little form of racial discrimination, all these things add up over time, which means that ultimately our responsibility is always, and it's constantly ongoing, and it's constantly there, whether we are musicians or artists or journalists or politicians. We have an ongoing obligation. which goes back, I guess, to the courage of being able to, as Kolbassia says, speak out when we see these things, because if we don't, when we assist in creating these permissive environments.
Fear can have positive and negative impacts. It can be, I'm so sorry, you can have positive fear and you can have negative fear. You can have fear which actually serves you and fear which doesn't serve you. And the question, what's your name? Nadine. The question from Nadine is, how do you distinguish between negative fear and positive fear and love? Love came into that as well.
Well, I was just thinking of them in contrast, and I was also thinking of the role our instincts play, and when we can't trust those instincts.
And how do we thank you. And how do we trust our instinct on what our relationship is with fear?
I think, yeah, thank you. Really, really important question. I think, one thing that I failed to say when I was talking about fear, courage, I think both of them have a positive and negative. Even courage has a positive and negative, impact of that. Too much courage can lead you to your death too, right? Yeah, and that can be play negatively on you, and fear can lead you to save. When I decided to flee, that's a fear. It's a positive fear. And through that time, through my journey to get from that fleeing torture to a space of safety, for example, the United Kingdom, more than 7 months passed, right? And during that period of the time when I was fleeing, I learned to understand my instinct. And I learned to appreciate my instinct. And during that time, I have so much time in my hand. I learned to develop that better so I can understand it better. But one thing, a first part of my fleeing, I'm going to tell you, I wasn't in control. If I say to you that I was in control, then I'm lying. I was not in control. And I can call it fear, right? The fear took control of my journey. But my goal at that moment, the goal that I gave to the fear part, is I want to be safe. So for me to be safe, my instinct took control, or my survival instinct took control and drove me. I was walking for days. I wouldn't feel tired. I'm not feeling hungry. I'm not feeling thirsty. Just continue and continue. And during that period, I was also really fearful of any human being. Because at that moment, I lost trust to human beings because they are danger for me, right? So all my motivation was motivated by that fear that saving my life and protecting that physical well-being was really, really important. And then from there, I started to learn how to really play with my instinct. And I really trust my instinct. I think Nadine, Sepide, and all those people, I talk to them too much about that, is that when I have the feeling, I know what that feeling is. I can, at the moment, I can define what is that. It does not mean that I just 100% right. It does not mean that. But at a certain moment, I am proved right. But the difference, the difference is to understand that the risk that those will come with, because everything that any decision you take based on your instinct has a risk attached to it. And what is that risk? Is it the risk will end up putting, because if the risk end up putting myself in danger, I can take that on me. But if that risk ends up putting another person in danger, that's something that I cannot bear. Right. So then what I have to do, if I know that is to put somebody else at risk so that I don't have a control of the outcome, but this risk is only for me individual, I still have that responsibility, accountability, for that outcome. And when you understand that, one, you control your fear. Secondly, you won't be bothered about controlling the outcome. Because when you really focus on we want to control the outcome, and that's what creates so much of anxiety at the moment, because we want to see the future. We're going to want to see the result. We want to see the outcome of what we taking the action in. And if you eliminate that, you just go and whatever come, let it be.
Yeah, I so agree with you that like the very basic thing is do no harm when in those kind of survival kind of moments. That's important. For me, if the situation, you have the luxury of not really taking action while you're in your emotional self, I think that's a good choice to make. Because I think the ultimate good choice is a choice that works when you're not motivated by emotions. Not to say rational, but just kind of works in different states. Because, yeah, and the other thing to do maybe is think long term, not just now. And see if that reaction or that fear or that thought aligns with your values. Because sometimes the instinct is not always right. The instincts can be cause for prejudice, for example. That's like, because we need to work on those side of our brains. So yeah, I think just remembering if those reactions or feelings or ideas align with the values you want to live by. I think that could be a good way around it.
Beautiful, thank you. Aarif. Everything's been covered. I'm just looking at the time and realizing that we're kind of running a little over time. So what I'd like to invite you to do is that when we do have dinner, that you come and find Kolbassia and Aarif and Rihab and continue the conversations with them, with the questions that you have. Listening to the three of you, I'm reminded of, I think it's the words of Paulo Coelho, but I may have confused Paulo Coelho and James Baldwin within the same sentence, within the same quote. But I think he said that unless, if we don't face our fears consume us, and if they consume us, we can't listen to our hearts. And I think something that all three of you have brought this evening is so much heart, and that there is such courage that you all show in the work that you do, whether it's pursuing that excellence in campaigning, in seeking justice, in performance. So I'd really love to invite you to, again, give a very warm thank you to Kolbassia Haoussou from Freedom from Torture, Aarif Abraham, international human rights barrister, and Rihab Azar.